Interview with me, or what do you want to watch?
I'll do it with you.
Oh, you want to do it with me?
Well done.
Okay.
Eric, will you help me grill your daddy? Should we ask him some questions?
One of the moments that crystallized this shift for many people happened on Britain's Got Talent, when a young dancer named Julia Carlisle performed despite living with a serious spinal condition called scoliosis. Her situation was not a subplot or a backstory added for sympathy. It was a reality that threatened to take her dancing away from her permanently. She was performing knowing that her body was working against her dream, and she was doing it anyway, with a discipline and a quiet courage that filled the room. Simon Cowell's reaction was not manufactured. Anyone who has watched enough of his television career knows the difference between performed emotion and the real thing, because he spent years demonstrating exactly how little patience he had for performance. What happened when Julia danced was real. He was affected. Not because it made good television, but because it touched something in him that had become newly raw. The image of a young person fighting through a medical condition to hold on to something they loved, it landed differently now. It landed like a father receiving information he had not asked for but could not return. What followed was something that received far less attention than it deserved. Simon personally funded Julia's surgery. The reported figure was in the region of $200,000, not a gesture, not a photo opportunity, but a direct intervention to make sure that a young person's medical future was not determined by financial circumstance. He did not make a large public announcement about it. He did not build a campaign around it. He simply made it happen and moved on. That act tells you more about the man Simon had become than any interview could. Because the Simon Cowell of 15 years ago was not incapable of generosity, but he was unlikely to express it in that particular way. Quietly. Without branding. Without calculating the return. That is not the behavior of someone performing transformation. That is the behavior of someone who has genuinely experienced it. Now here is where the internet took a real story and rebuilt it into something unrecognizable. When people began noticing Simon's emotional responses, his softened demeanor, his visible reaction to stories involving sick children, they started constructing a narrative that felt emotionally logical even though it had no factual foundation. The conclusion the internet reached was that Eric must be ill. That there must be a hidden diagnosis. That the only explanation for a father behaving this way was that he was privately dealing with something devastating involving his own child. The posts were specific in their vagueness, which is a particular art form in viral misinformation. They referenced unnamed sources and unverified medical information. They used clips of Simon looking serious or emotional without any context for when those clips were recorded or what they were actually about. They placed photographs of Eric next to language designed to suggest fragility. And they packaged all of it in a format designed to generate maximum emotional engagement before the viewer had time to ask any critical questions. The truth, supported by everything that has actually been reported and observed, is that Eric Cowell is a healthy, active child living a life that his father has deliberately tried to make as normal as possible given their circumstances. There is no verified diagnosis. There is no credible medical report. There is no statement from Simon, Lauren, or anyone connected to their family that supports the claims flooding social media. The diagnosis everyone was sharing was not real. It was constructed from the raw material of a father's visible love and projected onto a situation that does not exist. This matters because it reveals something important about how we consume information about public figures. Simon Cowell's emotional transformation is real. His love for his son is real. His decision to restructure his life around something other than professional achievement is real. None of that required a tragedy to explain it. Growth does not always come from crisis. Sometimes it comes from clarity. Sometimes a person simply looks at what they have been doing and decides they want to do something different. That is not a lesser story. That is actually a more hopeful one. But to dismiss the online speculation entirely would be to miss something worth examining. Because the reason those posts resonated, the reason millions of people shared them and believed them without looking further, is that they contained an emotional truth even when they got the facts completely wrong. People could see that something had happened to Simon Cowell. They could see that he was different. They could see that the change was connected to his son in some meaningful way. They just filled in the explanation incorrectly. the correct explanation is both simpler and more profound than a hidden illness. Simon Cowell became a father later in life, at 54 years old, after spending decades defining himself almost exclusively through his work. Eric arrived not just as a child but as a completely new frame through which to see everything. Every ambitious choice suddenly had a different weight when viewed through the question of what kind of example it set. Every late night in the studio carried a cost that had not previously existed. Every moment spent chasing professional perfection was now in direct competition with something that felt, for the first time, more important. He has described this transition in terms that are remarkably honest for someone who spent so long projecting invulnerability. He admitted that fatherhood made him happier in a way that success never quite had. He acknowledged that he had spent years operating at a pace that was unsustainable and that it took having something genuinely worth slowing down for before he was willing to do it. The 4 a.m. work sessions, the relentless self-imposed pressure, the inability to switch off even when his body was begging him to, those patterns did not disappear overnight, but they began to loosen. And the loosening of them revealed a man who had always been capable of warmth but had never previously considered it a professional asset. There is a version of Simon Cowell that the world thought it knew completely. The man who sat behind the judge's table with his arms crossed and his verdict already decided before the last note finished playing. The man who could reduce a grown adult to silence with a single sentence. The man who built one of the most powerful empires in television history not by being warm, but by being relentlessly, almost surgically, honest. For 2 decades, that image was bulletproof. It was consistent. It was his brand, his armor, and in many ways, his identity. And then, quietly, it started to crack. Not in one dramatic moment. Not with a single headline or a tearful confession on live television. It happened slowly, the way most real changes do, in the background, away from cameras, in the kind of private moments that never make it into a press release. People who had watched Simon Cowell for years started noticing something different. A pause where there used to be a sharp comment. A longer look at a struggling contestant where there used to be impatience. A gentleness that had absolutely no business being on the face of the man who once told a hopeful singer they had the vocal ability of a broken radio. Something had changed. And the world wanted to know what. The internet, being the internet, did not wait for an explanation. It built one. Stories started circulating about Simon's son, Eric Cowell, born in 2014 to Simon and his partner Lauren Silverman. The stories were emotional, dramatic, and designed to hit every pressure point a reader has. Rare illness. Heartbreaking diagnosis. A father brought to his knees by the one thing money and fame cannot protect you from. The thumbnails were devastating. The comment sections were flooded with sympathy. And the narrative spread the way only unverified emotional content can, fast, wide, and almost impossible to correct once it had taken hold. But here is what actually happened. And it is a far more layered, far more human story than anything a viral post could contain. To understand the transformation that Simon Cowell has undergone over the past several years, you have to go back to who he was before fatherhood entered the picture. Because Simon did not just have a child and soften slightly around the edges. He was a man running at a pace that was, by any honest measure, completely unsustainable. The entertainment industry rewards obsession, and Simon had weaponized his. He was known to work extraordinary hours, reviewing recordings late into the night, dissecting ratings, micromanaging productions, and treating sleep as an obstacle rather than a necessity. People around him described a man who was always switched on, always calculating, always 3 decisions ahead of the conversation he was currently having. This was not laziness dressed up as ambition. This was genuine, all-consuming dedication to building something that lasted. And it worked. American Idol, The X Factor, Britain's Got Talent, these were not accidents. They were the result of a man who refused to let anything slide, who held every detail to an almost punishing standard, and who had structured his entire life around professional achievement. But there is a cost to living like that. And Simon Cowell, for a long time, refused to acknowledge it. He has spoken in interviews about periods where his lifestyle caught up with him. The physical toll was real. A serious back injury in 2020, the result of an electric bike accident, forced him into surgery and a recovery period that stopped him in his tracks in a way nothing else had managed to do. He could not push through it. He could not schedule around it. He simply had to stop. And in that stillness, something shifted. When your body forces you to be still, your mind starts going places it normally runs too fast to visit. He described the recovery as genuinely difficult, not just physically, but mentally. Because for a man whose identity was built almost entirely on momentum, being forced to slow down felt like something close to loss. That experience changed his relationship with his own limitations. It introduced a humility that had not been visible before. And it set the stage for a much deeper reckoning with what kind of life he actually wanted to be living. Eric Cowell was born on Valentine's Day in 2014, and by Simon's own admission, nothing prepared him for what fatherhood actually felt like. He had been famous for decades. He had managed some of the biggest acts in music history. He had sat across from thousands of people and told them uncomfortable truths without flinching. And then this small person arrived and completely dismantled the emotional architecture he had spent a lifetime constructing. Simon has said openly that Eric changed everything. Not in the way people say it as a polite acknowledgement of parenthood, but in a way that genuinely altered how he moved through his days. He became protective in a manner he did not recognize in himself. He became aware of time in a way that ambition had previously blocked. He started thinking not about the next project or the next season, but about what kind of man his son would grow up watching. That question, apparently, kept him awake far more effectively than any ratings report ever had. Fatherhood did something specific to Simon Cowell that his success never could. It introduced vulnerability. Real, unmanageable, no strategy available vulnerability. Because when you love a child, you are permanently exposed to a fear that does not respond to control or money or influence. The fear that something could happen to them. That the world, which you have spent decades learning to navigate, does not extend the same protection to the people you love most. That is a terrifying thing to sit with. And for someone who had built their entire identity around being in control, it was particularly destabilizing. People noticed the change on screen before they fully understood it off screen. Simon started listening differently to contestants who shared personal struggles. He started asking follow-up questions. He started sitting with difficult moments rather than cutting through them. And when a contestant's story involved a child, or a parent, or a medical struggle, he responded in a way that his earlier self simply would not have allowed. The wall came down. Not completely, not all at once, but enough that millions of viewers registered the difference without quite being able to name it. There is a particular kind of empathy that only arrives after you have been truly frightened for someone you love. Not anxious, not worried, but genuinely, deeply frightened in the way that changes how your nervous system responds to certain kinds of information afterward. Simon Cowell, by his own account, experienced that fear when Eric had a health scare in his early years that was handled privately and without drama, as the family preferred. Details were kept out of the press deliberately, not because anything catastrophic occurred, but because Simon and Lauren were clear that their son's medical history was not public property. What that private experience did, however, was introduce Simon to a version of helplessness he had never encountered before. Here was a man who could make things happen by sheer force of will and resources, suddenly sitting in a situation where neither of those things was the most important factor. Where what mattered most was entirely outside his control. That kind of experience rewires something. It does not leave cleanly. It stays in the body and in the responses and in the way certain stories land differently than they used to. This is why, when people watch Simon on Britain's Got Talent now and see him visibly moved by a child's struggle, they are not watching a performance. They are watching a man whose emotional responses have been permanently recalibrated by his experience of loving someone who is vulnerable in ways he cannot fix. Every sick child who walks onto that stage activates something real in him. Not because Eric is sick, but because Simon now knows exactly what it feels like to love someone enough that their vulnerability becomes your own. That is the emotional goodbye that the headlines got almost right but described almost entirely wrong. It was not a goodbye to a person. It was a goodbye to a way of being. A farewell to the version of himself that moved through the world without that particular weight. Because once you love someone that deeply, once you understand what it would mean to lose them, you do not get to go back to the person you were before you knew that. The door closes behind you. What has emerged on the other side of that door is something that Simon Cowell himself seems genuinely surprised by. He appears, in the interviews and appearances he has given in recent years, to actually enjoy his life in a way that his earlier success never quite seemed to grant him. There is a lightness to how he talks about Eric that is almost startling when you contrast it with the controlled, guarded way he used to discuss everything. He lights up. Not for the camera, not for the story, but in the involuntary way that people do when they are talking about something that has rearranged their priorities in a way they endorse. He has spoken about watching Eric grow up and finding himself genuinely curious about who his son is becoming, rather than trying to map his son's future onto a plan. For someone who spent decades being the architect of other people's careers, that kind of non-interference is significant. It suggests a man who has learned the difference between influence and control, and who has decided that one of them is no longer something he wants to exercise over the people closest to him. His relationship with Lauren Silverman has also been central to this evolution. She has reportedly been a grounding presence throughout the changes Simon has undergone, someone who held space for the quieter version of him that was trying to emerge while the louder, more recognizable version was still dominating the public image. The couple became engaged in 2013, and the stability of that relationship has been, by most accounts, one of the consistent threads running through a period of significant personal transformation. The television industry, meanwhile, has watched all of this with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Because Simon Cowell without his armor is still Simon Cowell. He has not become someone who accepts mediocrity or abandons standards. He has not turned Britain's Got Talent into an extended group therapy session. What has changed is the space between the judgment and the delivery of it. There is more room now for a person to be a full human being in front of him before he decides what he thinks of their performance. That is a small change that makes an enormous difference. Producers and colleagues who have worked with him across multiple seasons have noted that he prepares differently now. He is still rigorous, still demanding, still the person who will identify the exact moment a performance stopped working and articulate why with unsettling precision. But he is less interested in the sharp landing and more interested in whether what he is saying is actually useful to the person hearing it. That shift, from criticism as performance to criticism as communication, is the mark of someone who has thought seriously about the impact of their words on other people's lives. It is also, quietly, the mark of a man who has spent time imagining what it would feel like to be on the receiving end of a verdict delivered without compassion. When you love a child who will one day go out into a world full of people like the person you used to be, you start reconsidering some things. There are people who will read this and find it unsatisfying. They came for a diagnosis and they are getting a story about personal growth, and those are not the same thing. But personal growth, when it is genuine and hard-won and visible in the way Simon Cowell's has been, is not a consolation prize. It is actually the more significant story. Because illness happens to people. Transformation is chosen. And what Simon Cowell has chosen, repeatedly and consistently over the past several years, is to be a different kind of person than the one he spent decades becoming. He chose to slow down when slowing down felt like failure. He chose to be present when presence cost him the kind of productivity that had always defined him. He chose to let himself be affected by other people's pain when emotional distance had previously been his most reliable professional tool. None of those choices were easy for a man whose identity was built on self-sufficiency, control, and the careful management of his own image. Every single one of them required him to walk away from something familiar and trusted. And Eric was the reason. Not because Eric is sick. Not because there was a diagnosis that forced Simon's hand. But because Eric is here, and healthy, and growing up, and watching. And Simon Cowell, the man who spent decades not caring what anyone thought of him, has discovered that there is one set of eyes he cares about enormously. One small person whose opinion of him matters in a way that no television rating has ever quite managed to replicate. That is the story. Not a tragedy, but a transformation. Not a goodbye forced by grief, but one chosen through love. The man who is emerging from the far side of this chapter is recognizably Simon Cowell, but assembled differently. The intelligence is still there. The instinct for talent is still there. The refusal to be satisfied with average is absolutely still there. But it is housed now in someone who understands that being right is not the same as being kind, and that the most accurate verdict in the room is sometimes the least useful one. Eric Cowell is, by every reliable account, a healthy, happy child growing up in a household where he is loved without condition and protected with genuine ferocity. The dramatic story the internet told about him was false. But the emotional truth beneath it, the sense that something important had happened to Simon Cowell, that fatherhood had reached into him and rearranged something fundamental, that part was completely accurate. The real diagnosis was never about Eric. It was about Simon. A diagnosis of everything that had been missing. Everything he had been moving too fast to notice. Everything that a person accumulates when they spend 30 years building an empire and forget to build a life alongside it. And the treatment for that particular condition turned out to be simpler and more profound than anything medicine could.